For hours after the explosion, the men inside Chernobyl's control room believed the reactor was still intact. That belief shaped every decision they made that night, and by the time it finally collapsed, the damage had already been done. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 was destroyed in a way no one inside the plant had been trained to recognize. The explosion was sudden, violent, and completely outside the design assumptions of the RBMK reactor. But the most dangerous part of the disaster wasn't the blast itself. It was what followed. Confusion, assumptions, and a desperate attempt to force reality back into a system that no longer existed. When the first alarm sounded, the engineers did what they had been trained to do. They checked instruments, they reviewed readouts, they searched for familiar patterns. In every previous incident, alarms meant imbalance, not annihilation. A valve stuck, a pump failed, a control rod misbehaved. There was always something to fix. The idea that the reactor itself was gone simply didn't register. RBMK reactors were considered powerful, but stable. Dangerous if mishandled, yes, but incapable of exploding. That assumption wasn't arrogance. It was doctrine. It was written into manuals, reinforced in training, accepted at every level of the Soviet nuclear program. So when operators suggested that the core might be destroyed, the idea was rejected almost immediately. Senior engineer Anatoly Dyatlov insisted the reactor was intact. To him, the explosion could only mean internal damage, not total failure. Instruments still showed water flow, some pressure readings still appeared normal. These signals reinforced what he already believed. What no one realized yet was that the instruments were lying. Cables had been severed by the explosion. Sensors were no longer connected to the systems they were supposed to measure. Gauges were displaying meaningless values, echoes of a structure that no longer existed. But in the chaos of the control room, with alarms screaming and phones ringing, it was impossible to separate real data from false reassurance. The engineers assumed the reactor needed cooling. That assumption would define the rest of the night. Men were ordered to pump water into the core. Valves were opened manually. Emergency systems were forced online despite physical damage. Every action was based on the belief that nuclear fuel was still contained inside the reactor vessel. It wasn't. The reactor core had been exposed to open air. Fuel assemblies were burning. Graphite blocks were scattered across the building and the roof. The reactor hall itself was open to the sky. But that reality existed outside the control room, separated by concrete walls, darkness, and disbelief. Radiation levels near the reactor were already lethal. Inside the control room, dosimeters began to fail almost immediately. Most could only measure up to a few roentgens per hour. Once levels exceeded that range, the needles simply stopped moving. Engineers assumed radiation was elevated but manageable, high but temporary. In truth, exposure levels were hundreds, even thousands of times higher. Some operators began to feel physical effects, a metallic taste in the mouth, a burning sensation on the skin, pressure behind the eyes. These symptoms were unfamiliar and easy to dismiss. Radiation sickness doesn't cause immediate pain. There is no clear signal telling you to stop. That silence creates dangerous confidence. As the hours passed, reports from outside the control room grew more disturbing. Firefighters described glowing chunks of material scattered around the site. They reported pieces that looked like graphite. Engineers dismissed these accounts. Graphite, they insisted, could not be outside the reactor. If graphite was visible, it would mean the core itself had been exposed, and that was impossible. But the reports continued. Radiation readings from mobile units contradicted control room instruments. Firefighters began collapsing. External teams reported extreme exposure near Reactor 4. Each new piece of information clashed with the assumptions guiding the response. Still, the engineers continued. Alexander Akimov remained at his post, coordinating cooling efforts long after it was clear something was deeply wrong. He believed his responsibility was to save the reactor, not abandon it. To stop cooling would be to accept failure, and acceptance felt more dangerous than action. Men were sent into flooded areas to open valves manually. They waded through radioactive water in near darkness, trusting that their efforts were preventing a larger catastrophe. Many of them had no idea what dose they were receiving. No one did. By the time the truth began to emerge, it did not arrive as a dramatic revelation. There was no moment of shouting, no single sentence that changed everything. It came quietly. Water levels made no sense. Pressure readings contradicted each other. Cooling efforts had no effect. Firefighters were being rushed to hospitals with symptoms that no ordinary exposure could explain. External measurements confirmed radiation far beyond what the control room instruments could register. At some point before dawn, the engineers understood the unthinkable. There was no reactor to save. The core was gone. The containment had failed. What they had been fighting for hours was no longer there. The systems they trusted were irrelevant. Procedure had reached its limit. By then, many of the men in the control room had already received fatal doses of radiation. What makes that night especially haunting is not incompetence. It is belief. These were trained professionals operating exactly as they had been taught. The RBMK design was presented as fundamentally safe. The possibility of an explosion was excluded from emergency planning entirely. When the impossible happened, there was no mental framework to process it. They acted rationally inside a false reality. As morning approached, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. Radiation was spreading beyond the plant. Evacuation was discussed cautiously, delayed by uncertainty and fear of panic. The men who had stayed at their posts were sent to hospitals. Some walked in under their own power, still convinced they had done the right thing. Many never walked out. In the years that followed, blame would be assigned. Names would be debated. Reports would be written and rewritten. But the deeper truth remained uncomfortable. Chernobyl was not destroyed by a single mistake or a single person. It was destroyed by certainty, by a system that allowed no room for failure, no room for the unthinkable, and no preparation for reality once it broke through. That night the engineers did not realize it was too late, because they were careless. They realized it was too late because they had been taught that this could never happen. And when understanding finally arrived, it came quietly, without warning, and without mercy. Chernobyl did not end in the explosion. It ended in realization.